And then he did his postdoc at Princeton, and then as NSF fellow again at RIT. So he's going to talk today about the core collapse supernova, but his research is also in the interacting binary that are post-main sequence binaries, then compact objects, and he will also have a very short presentation, maybe 10 minutes, on the how you can use astronomy and visual tools to help develop learning tools for deaf and hard to hear.
You can be through the RIT. I was the first student.
Yeah, so that's right. Fabio was the first graduate student from RIT, so I actually didn't do my PhD at RIT. I did my PhD at the University of Rochester, which is only about a mile away. So you can see how these things sometimes get confused, but thank you for the introduction. Okay, so I know one of my collaborators, Christian Ott, was here a few weeks ago, so what I thought I would do, I'm sure he covered a lot of the nice work that he's been doing and that Evan has been doing in core collapse theory, and what I thought I would do is I'd actually kind of focus on two particular topics in core collapse theory. So we can go over some of the introductory stuff, focus on one result which I think at this point in time is fairly well established, and one result in core collapse theory that I think is fairly controversial at this point. And then for the last 10 or 15 minutes, I want to kind of talk about and advertise some work I've been doing to build and create learning opportunities for deaf and hard of hearing students in astronomy. Okay, so I like to start out talks on core collapse with this quote from one of Kurt Vonnegut's novels, The Sirens of Titan. Every passing hour brings the solar system 43,000 miles closer to globular cluster M13 and Hercules, and still there are some misfits who insist there is no such thing as progress. And maybe you don't understand why this is an interesting quote and why I think it applies to core collapse, and I'll just spend a minute talking about that. So we've known for quite a long time that stars explode, single stars, core collapse events happen, produce supernovae, we observe them all the time. We've had kind of a theory for how they might explode since basically the mid-60s, but now we are almost half a century later and we still cannot definitively say this is the mechanism with which core collapse supernovae explode. So along the way there's been a lot of work done and there's been a lot of progress made, but we're still not over the hurdle to actually say how these stars definitively explode. So the science part of my talk, which again will be about the first 30-40 minutes, will basically be split into three parts. I'll briefly go over some of the current containing explosion models. The neutrino mechanism, this is still the favored one. This has been the favored one since the mid-60s. This is the one that we're constantly trying to see if it actually works in the computational simulations. I'll briefly mention the MHD mechanism, where you have very rapid rotation and differential rotation in the core of a star, and you can probably power jets that then pull the star apart. And I'll briefly mention also what's known as the acoustic mechanism. This was brought up in the mid 2005, 2006, which I think at this point has basically been ruled out, and probably this was some sort of numerical artifact that doesn't really exist. And the science topics I'll talk about is the well-established result, which is how you get acceleration of neutron stars, so neutron star kicks, pulsar kicks, from the birth of asymmetric supernovae explosions. And then the controversial result, which is does going to 3D in our simulations actually help facilitate the explosion, or does it not facilitate it over axisymmetric counterparts? And I'll talk about recent papers within the last 6 months that have broached this topic. Just to acknowledge some of my collaborators, Mandy Morant-Sue, Tim Brandt, a graduate student at Princeton who's now a postdoc at the Institute for Advanced Study, Adam, of course, at Princeton, Lawrence Berkeley, Ann Almgren, computational scientist, and of course at Caltech, Christian Ott. Okay, so briefly, for core collapse, you have a core of a massive star, and what happens is eventually that iron core starts to collapse in on itself, and you have this infalling envelope of material. Now, as that process happens, the density in the center of the star increases and increases until basically the equation of state stiffens at nuclear densities. And at that point, the protoneutron star is essentially born down in the center. That stiffening of the equation of state then launches a shock wave outward. And that shock wave then propagates outward against this infalling material until it essentially stalls due to neutrino losses and nuclear dissociation effects. And at that point, you basically have infalling material on material that's trying to push its way out, and you get a standing accretion shock. And then what happens is basically, as that shock wave propagates up, it dissociates everything. So you have a bunch of free nucleons that are just hanging out in these regions here. Now, as the proto-neutron star is being born, you build up this sea of neutrinos. And those neutrinos will start to diffuse out from the protoneutrons, from the neutrino spheres, basically, right in the protoneutron star here. As those neutrinos diffuse outward, they can capture on the free nucleons in this gain region. And the current thing with the neutrino mechanism is that if you can capture enough of these neutrinos, there's 10 to the 53 ergs of neutrinos, so you only have to capture something like 10 to 51 to maybe multiples of that, 10% something. If you can capture enough energy in the neutrinos from the free nucleons there, what you can do is you can take this stalled shock here and you can re-energize it so that it propagates outward and eventually blows up the star. Now, so the way we investigate these effects is we have to do computations. There's just no other way about it, and that's because we have a long laundry list here of things that are potentially important. And just to go over these, gravity obviously is important. Neutrino transport is very important. This stalled shock region becomes highly turbulent, convective, neutrino-driven convection. There's low L-order modes that become important in certain contexts. The progenitor star could potentially be rotating. If it's magnetized and has some sort of initial rotation, then as it collapses in on itself, there'll be strong differential rotation. That could be important for generation of magnetic fields. Nuclear burning on infall can happen, and of course you have a protoneutron star down here in the center, so GR effects can also become important. And you guys have a very good core collapse theorist here who studies the effects of GR in Evan, so I'm sure you've heard from things about him, but if you're more interested in this, ask Evan. The main point is that this is also an inherently multidimensional problem, and you have to do basically the entire problem in 3D. So the goal here is to produce sufficiently physical models in 3D that we actually believe. And probably the end game is not only do you predict explosions, but you match things like yields of various elements, neutron star kicks, pulsar spins, blah blah blah. Basically, all of the observable quantities which happen well after the explosion itself happens. And from this, we might be decently far away, I think. But in terms of the computations, what typically happens is you can't do all of these, so you'll do some of them. So I typically do neutrino transport in fluid dynamics and leave out rotation, magnetic field, photosynthesis, and GR effects, although you can incorporate GR corrections in a somewhat simplistic way. Okay. So just to kind of advertise, like this is a still of a typical simulation. The size scale here is, you see the protoneutron star down here in the center, that's this little pink guy here. This might be a couple hundred kilometers in distance here. And then basically the simulation box extends out to about 10,000 kilometers. So most of the simulation is infalling material. This is essentially your stalled shock here, and you've got a very turbulent kind of region in here, which is this gain region where you're capturing neutrinos and hoping to re-energize that stalled shock. Okay, so a brief history of the field is essentially in the early 60s, 1961, Stirling Colgate basically pioneered this direct hydrodynamic collapse mechanism, where if you don't do any of the neutrino transport, if you just look at the hydrodynamics, the core starts to compress, everything starts falling inward. You get to a very you create the protoneutron star. The shock wave launches outward, and if you just think about the hydrodynamics, that shock has plenty of energy. It propagates out. It blows up the star. Problem solved. No big deal. Stirling also realized in '66. Okay, when you form this protoneutron star, densities and temperatures are very high, you should produce a lot of neutrinos. And those neutrinos then, through that diffusion out of the neutrino sphere, basically sap all of the energy out of the shock. So that shock has plenty of energy, it's hemorrhaging neutrinos, and it's dissociating everything in front of it. And that shock did stall. But Stirling proposed a solution to that, which is if you just wait long enough, those diffusing neutrinos that are coming out of those neutrino spheres, you wait long enough, you can capture enough of those on the free nucleons that maybe that shock then turns around and keeps propagating outward. So that's the early history of the field. And I'm going to do something that's kind of egregious here. I'm going to talk about kind of the current status of everything from like 1995 to basically now. And again, people have spent their lives just trying to study this one problem. So this is I'm just glossing over everything and putting it into a few words. But essentially, since computations, axisymmetric computations in the mid-90s occurred, we've noticed something in the simulations, which is that for spherically symmetric progenitors, if you do calculations, just spherically symmetric calculations, the vast majority of progenitors do not explode. If you have a very, very low mass progenitor where it has kind of an envelope that doesn't have a lot of mass to it, you can get those to explode, but they're not generic. If you go to take those same progenitors in the spherically symmetric case and do an axisymmetric calculation now, what you find is that some of those ones that couldn't blow up in spherical symmetry actually do produce marginal explosions when you go to axis symmetry. And those could be, so they could be under energetic explosions, but again, those are most of the very, very, very low mass progenitors, the 8.8, the 9 solar mass progenitors, not a 15 solar mass, not a 20 solar mass. But the question then is, because there's a difference here between these two, if you go from axisymmetric calculations up into fully three-dimensional calculations, do you see some sort of similar effect, where now more of the progenitors are exploding? And I'll talk about that in a bit.
Can I ask a question?
Yes?
How do you define explode? Is it just like the shock can all the way out?
Yes, so I'll show, let's look at this movie here. So you have the influx shock here. The shock is basically stalled more or less at this point. So an explosion will be defined when this shock starts the propagation outward and doesn't stop, which in this case will occur, wait for it, here it comes. There we go. So that, I would call this an explosion. So it's had enough time to absorb all those neutrinos, its entropy is going up, it's gaining energy, and eventually there's a point at which the shock it just propagates outward without reversing. And this has enough energy at this point to propagate all the way through the star and to explode the thing. One question could be, what's the asymptotic explosion energy? And that's a little dicey. Sometimes you produce under-energetic explosions. So a typical core collapse event would produce something like a 10 to the 51 erg explosion. In the computer simulations, sometimes we produce 10 to the 50 erg explosions. Do you call that a successful supernova? I don't know. Maybe not. But this is essentially the neutrino mechanism. Let me just play this one more time so you can see it. So again, the material is falling in, it's still falling in. You start with something that's initially essentially spherical. Basically, it's subject to a lot of instabilities. This is probably neutrino-driven convection here that's causing all this turbulence and whatnot. It's gaining neutrinos in this gain region right here, and then eventually it will explode up. And this one down here, you can see there's a neutrino-driven wing that's bleeding material off the surface of the protoneutron star. So this is an axis. This is actually, so this is a calculation from about the mid-90s. Now there's also MHD explosion mechanisms. These can produce bipolar explosions, basically, and the idea here is that if the progenitor has some sort of rotation associated with it, sufficient rotation, when that iron core collapses, you spin it up, there's an enormous amount of differential rotation energy down in the core, you can wind the magnetic field up, and the magnetic field then eventually builds until it blows up like a jack-in-the-box. And so there's been some work done on this, and this simulation is due to Adam in 07.
Initial core period of 2 seconds, that seems, that's breakup basically.
Yeah, exactly. Well,
or it's just the initial proton.
Yeah, so this is, I mean, if you're producing a millisecond pulsar down in the center, then this is possible. This is for linear winding, though. So this is the period you need if you're just going to linearly wind the field. If you actually want to non-linearly amplify the field, like a dynamo process, you can go to periods much, much, much longer than that, and you have no problem. So what you're going to see here are these are field lines eventually, again, linear winding, so they're being wound up down here in the center. There's no, well, okay, let me back. So they're building, and which we're going to zoom out here, and you're going to see them start to kind of tunnel out of the star like that. So, and there they go. So this is similar, but again, this has different predictions for the neutrino mechanism. This would be more of a bipolar ejection tunneling way out of the star. It's not clear at all how many progenitors would be subject to this. I think common wisdom, which may or may not be right, is that only the most rapidly rotating ones would produce something like this. I don't know. Yep.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but I think all the MHD simulations which do explode, they don't simulate the build-up of magnetic field. They start with
a very strong field. Yes, that's right.
Huge field.
Yes, that's right. So the field in here it's like 10 to the 10 to the 11 or 10 to the 12 Gauss field initially. And that's because of linear winding. So if you take that field, then you can wind it up to get it to whatever you need to blow up 10 to the 13, 10 to the 14 Gauss. If you have some sort of way to exponentially amplify the field from some seed value, then you could start with something that's much lower and maybe rapidly amplify to. But again, it all comes down to how much energy you have in differential rotation and then possibly convection down in the center. But yes, that's a good point. These are very strong fields they start with initially. Actually, there's not been much work done on this at all, I think. So there's probably a lot of stuff that could be done. Okay, the third mechanism is kind of this what's called the acoustic mechanism, and I'll show you kind of how this works. Basically, we're going to go down to the core of the star here, but this is showing us the protoneutron star is down here. And what's going to happen is, as this is actually an axisymmetric calculation, but it's been revolved to look like a 3D calculation. And what you're going to see is that there's going to be low entropy plumes, which kind of plunge down on the side here and ping the neutron star. So what happens is the neutron star starts wobbling up and down like this. And that ringing of the neutron star then creates sound waves which propagate outward. And those sound waves then dissipate their energy. So you can see it's pinging here, up and down, up and down, up and down. Those basically sound waves propagate outward to the gain region. They dump their energy there. And if you wait long enough, about 1 to 2 seconds, the amount of sound waves, the energy that the sound waves deposit is enough to actually explode the star. In the simulation, this produces kind of an explosion in one direction, not in both directions, but again, it's like a self-excited oscillator. Okay, so there's a couple of reasons why at least I don't think that this is a real, this occurs in nature. One is that this has been, people have tried to simulate this with many codes now at this point, tried to simulate this with a different code too. No one's ever been able to reproduce it in any other context. I think something went wrong with the numerics here. There's also some general theory. It's a nice paper between Nevin Weinberg and Elliot Clark, which is that there's a parametric daughter mode which kind of saturates the power at something that's 3 orders of magnitude less than the typical supernova, 10 to the 51 Hz. So I think there's some theory as to why this might not work in nature, but then again, that there's no other code that's been able to produce this at all. So I think this, you'd probably even Adam would agree, this is probably not a real mechanism for exploding stars. Okay, so I'm going to start and I'm going to talk about one result which is, I think, well established at this point. And what do I mean by well established? I mean it's been independently verified by 3 different codes with 5 different papers in 2 dimensions and 3 dimensions. So when you have broad-based from different groups with different simulation codes, all basically giving the same qualitative and quantitative agreement, then I would say in the core collapse field, that's probably a well-established result. My second topic will give you a counterexample of that, where we've all looked at something with 3 different codes and we've all produced 3 different answers that are not in qualitative or quantitative agreement. So, okay. So if you look at pulsars, neutron stars, so at birth, pulsars typically get velocities that have some sort of average about 300 to 400 kilometers per second, all the way up to maybe about 1,000 kilometers per second. And this is well above what their progenitor populations have, which is something like 10 kilometers per second. So at the time of a supernova and the birth of a pulsar, something happens that accelerates the pulsars up to very, very high speeds. And so one of the things I wanted to do is no group has ever been able to self-consistently simulate this in a code. And what I mean by that is follow actually the collapse, the formation of the neutron star on the grid, the subsequent explosion, and then the acceleration of the neutron star itself. So people have done things where they've started right after, they've just basically imposed an explosion, they've cut out the core so there's no neutron star on the grid, and these particular papers down in here, and they've been very nice because they've said that, okay, you can accelerate pulsars up to very high velocities, but again, there's a lot of numerical things they did to kind of facilitate these calculations. I wanted to see if we could actually do the entire problem from start to finish and see if I get something similar to what the Garshin group has gotten. And so in 2010, I published this in PhysRevD. This was the first calculation ever to include the neutron star on the grid and actually see the kit. And so what we saw is primarily an explosion in this direction and then a recoil of the neutron star in this direction. And I'll show a movie of that now. So what you'll see here is on the right, you'll see the global simulation setup. So you'll see the explosion here, and again, it will primarily go up. And what you'll see over here is the neutron star form. This is the inner 50 kilometers, and you'll see the neutron star accelerated down this way. Okay, and so the explosion will be starting sometime right about now, I would say. And you can see again, it's primarily up in this direction. And as that happens, you're blowing up material here, and you're going to start accelerating down in that direction.
So was a neutrino built in there?
So what we did, so this is a axisymmetric calculation with full neutrino and neutrino transport with just also rad hydro calculation. And because we can't blow them up in axisymmetric calculations in 2D, I had supplemented the neutrino luminosity. So I put in a little extra neutrino luminosity to induce an explosion, and then saw what happened.
But that was symmetric.
Yes, exactly. And so what we saw is that you could accelerate, and this was encouraging because we got up to about 150 kilometers per second, which is not, the average for these systems, but it's not bad either. And what we saw is at the end of the calculation, there was still significant acceleration. So that if you waited something like another few seconds, you could reach basically a canonical pulsar kick velocity. Yes.
What is up?
Oh, what is up?
And what is down? And
Okay,
what
so
accelerates the neutron star in the end?
Yes, okay, so this figure here shows, so up, there's plus D and minus D, and one is up and one's down. Because this is axisymmetric, the only way the neutron star can accelerate is in the plus D or minus D direction, because everything else cancels, right?
What gives that symmetry? Is it up and down?
It's axisymmetric, so this is just, I'm actually only simulating this, and everything else on here is axisymmetric calculation, so.
Why is going up and not down?
I'll get to that question at the point in a second. It depends on the time of explosion, where the asymmetry in that shocked material is. And I'll show examples where they go up and they go down. But hold on one second. Yep.
Is the star spinning?
No, this is not rotating. This is a non-rotating projector. Okay. This shows you where the contribution from the kick is coming. Now, there's two things I want you to take away from this. First is that for a long time, several people at least have proposed that if you have a 1% asymmetry in the neutrino field, then you can naturally just accelerate pulsars to what you need. The problem has been that you usually don't get a 1% asymmetry, or you need a very strong magnetic field in the interior of the neutron star, something like 10 to the 16, 10 to 17 gauss to achieve something like a 1% asymmetry. So the first thing you notice is that the neutrinos, the contributions from the neutrinos is something on the order of a few kilometers per second to the entire kit. So they're not contributing much at all. So the neutrinos are not really doing anything in terms of the kit. What is doing something is the hydrodynamics itself. And at the late time, so we kind of decompose this into the effect due to gravity, the effect due to kind of asymmetric momentum, and asymmetric pressure. And the dominant effect actually is the gravity. And I'll kind of show this on the board over here. So what happens is when you have your neutron stars formed right here, and you get some sort of asymmetric explosion like this, what you get is you get high velocity material shooting up in this direction, but you get low velocity material down in this direction. You have to conserve momentum during this process. And what happens is, because you're flinging off the high velocity material this way, the neutron star is kicked downward, but there's material down here that's slowly moving away. And this material exerts a gravitational pull on this neutron star. In the late time acceleration, everything basically in this regime here is due to this material here moving away from the neutron star, but pulling it with it. And over time, this stuff is moving faster, so that effect will go to basically zero. But this is the dominant effect, which is accelerating the neutron star to its 200 kilometers per second at that point in time. So that's what's doing it. It's the pull, the slow-moving ejecta in whatever direction the asymmetry is. Now, if you think about this, you can get kicks. So if you had a symmetric explosion, you would get no kick, no matter what energy, right? If you had an asymmetric explosion, you can imagine that what the kick will correlate with is the degree of asymmetry in the ejecta and the explosion energy itself. So the more explosive the event, you might be able to get the same kick with maybe less asymmetry in the ejecta, and vice versa. So those two things are essentially what it should correlate with. I'll show you an example of that in a second. Okay. And again, this is just a movie showing that the radiation field doesn't matter. The neutrinos don't matter for the kick. What you'll see here is these are the vectors are actually the flux vectors for 21 MeV electron neutrinos. So now that's the neutrino burst, and everything else is showing entropy, so it's showing the matter. And what you'll notice here is that the matter goes all over the place, but the neutrinos themselves are basically isotropic. So it's really the matter that dominates this. And you'll see it here starting to move. Neutrinos, no matter what the matter's doing, basically staying isotropic.
Are you solving neutrino transport?
Yes, in that calculation it was, yeah.
Multi-group.
Yes, multi-group neutrino transport, that's right, yeah.
And it basically smooths out the field though.
Yes,
So
it does, okay, fair point. It does, multi-group does smooth out the field. I mean, I guess the point is the optical depths in the regions of interest are low. So, I mean, okay, yeah, it's a fair point. It's multi-group, so it does smooth out a bit more than it would otherwise. Okay. So that was the first calculation. We only have basically one result, and it's because it's very expensive to do neutrino transport in these calculations, even axis symmetry and 2D. So what I did is I backed off and I said, okay, if neutrinos don't matter as much for the explosion, it's really the hydrodynamics. Let's do something else. Let's use another code, adaptive mesh code I have, and let's put in a kind of a more crude form of transport, which is just kind of heating and cooling the neutrinos. And let's do a bunch of these explosions to see if they go up or they go down, or what do they do, and what kind of distribution of kicks can you get. And so I use Castro. This is a radiation hydro code. It's now publicly available, so if you want to use it, you can download it. I can give you the website for that. And what this is an AMR code, so you can put the cells where you need them, and you can do calculations much faster, essentially. And so what we saw is I did a bunch of calculations like this, where I just dialed up and down the neutrino luminosities, the driving luminosities, and I got a range of kicks that ranged from something like, I guess the biggest one I got was 650 kilometers, all the way down to things that were like, I think this guy right here turns out to be like 25 kilometers. And again, it correlates with the degree of asymmetry at the time of the explosion and the energy of the explosion itself. And we got about, let's see, out of the 8 simulations we did, we got 3 that happened down and 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 that happened up. And again, it depends on the time. If all the shock is sloshing around and it's all the way up in the positive Z direction when the explosion happens, then the kick will be down. If it's all the way down at the bottom, then the kick will be up. So that's what it correlates.
So would you think that this is basically the 1D equivalent, and in real 3D you have 2 more directions?
Yeah, so that's interesting, right? So it would be nice to do this because the neutron star can only go up or down. In 3D, not only do you get whatever direction the neutron star wants to go and the explosion happens in, but you also can get the pulsar spin too. So you can correlate the spins with the kicks. And that's something that would be really nice to do with this particular code. Again, for these set of calculations, saw similar things to what I saw before. Gravity was the dominant effect, so it's the slow-moving regions up here that are pulling the neutron star in that direction. We could follow the explosions longer in time with Castro because it was adaptive mesh code, basically to where the neutron star started to decouple from its immediate surroundings.
But you are certainly getting much larger mass asymmetries here, based on these pictures.
From the other one? Yeah.
Much bigger wall than we can see in the first generation of 3D.
Oh, the first generation of 3D calculations. Yeah, maybe that's true.
You have very strong.
Yeah, no, okay. So
asymmetries.
one thing is when you impose a boundary on the grid, it's almost, I think it's extremely difficult for the computation to not know anything about that boundary. So you're right. So when you go to a 3D calculation, you do the full grid, now there's not a boundary, the matter doesn't know to flow along the boundary, for instance. So the degree of asymmetry tends to be less.
These were all done with 15 solar mass per generator?
15 solar mass per generator, yes, that's right. Yeah.
So is the kick that you are getting is a kind of statistical leftover from maybe turbulent vortices or whatever?
Right.
Or is it a generic instability type of result?
Well, so you're asking, at the time of the explosion, typically the instability that's happening is you've got an enormous amount of, well, basically you've got turbulence, which is primarily, I think, due to neutrino-driven convection. And at that point, it's deformed the shock in some way that then blows up and drags the neutron star with it. So, is that what you're asking? Yeah, neutrino-driven convection. I mean, there's also, like, people studied low L order modes, the scaling accretion shock instability, which seems to be more important in axisymmetric calculations than in 3D calculations. But there's a lot of instabilities that can occur down in this shock gain region. Again, this just shows that the gravity of this little ejecta is what dominates the kicks at the time. Okay. And I just wanted to show this again. So this shows that the larger the degree of asymmetry, the larger the kick. Alpha is kind of some measure of the degree of asymmetry. So here, if you have something that's more symmetric, it produces a lower kick than if you have something that's more asymmetric, which produces a higher kick. And then this just shows that even though we have to supplement the neutrino luminosities, it produces basically explosions that are in the ballpark. And these are 10 to 51 erg explosions that are actually occurring. And at the very end of the calculation, there's a very, very little amount of bound material still around the neutron star. So I think this stuff, I mean, this could fall back or could just keep blowing up, but most of the matter has been injected at that point. It is formally unbound. Okay. And again, in 3D, you can do things like you can actually measure the pulsar spins too. And so we did one paper in this back in 2010 where we were, from a non-rotating 15 solar mass progenitor, we were looking at basically the pulsar period as a function of where you cut the mass, and we found very slow rotation things. It was anywhere from like 2 seconds up to 40 seconds, depending on where you make the cut. And the explosion in time was something like this. Okay. And there's a very nice paper here from the Garshin group, which did the spin and kick, and actually they had another paper this past year also doing this in 3D. And again, they cut the cores out, but they were finding comparable kicks in 3D as to what you get in 2D, and they weren't finding much alignment with the spins and kicks, but that's because they weren't really doing any sort of fast rotators. They were doing very slow rotators.
So does this suggest that the spin periods that we see are all from primordial rotation?
I don't want to say anything about the spin periods we see, because again, this is a non-rotating progenitor.
Well, no, but that's some level that I meant. That with a non-rotating progenitor, you don't get the right period.
Yeah, you're not going to get, I mean, what is okay, if you have a progenitor that's not rotating at all, right, you have to conserve angular momentum. So what has to happen is you have to get a shearing region down in that shocked region. And that shearing region, you separate into plus and minus angular momentum. You got to eject the plus angular momentum and have all the minus angular momentum follow the neutron star to have any hope of spinning that up to some large amount. And you just don't, I mean, you carry a lot of weight, almost all the angular momentum with that. You get these shearing regions, but they just blow right off. So they don't fall back on the neutron stars. So,
but then basically, since we know, but sort of know that kicks are aligned with the rotational axis, that means the kick has to happen, the asymmetry has to have something to do with the rotation too then.
Exactly, yeah.
Do we still know that? I mean,
I felt so, yeah.
There have been some, like,
It's quite
Kramer has been doing this stuff.
Yeah, Simon Johnston makes
And
quite a lot of
the issue is that you look at that stuff, and I can't, begin to reproduce it, right? I mean, it's incredibly complicated geometry and polarimetry, and
Well, but then there's
What do you
the
take
famous,
away?
right? There's the crab where you can see it with your eyes. There's the other you can see it with your eyes. So I know, but
I mean,
I haven't seen clear counterexamples where you know what the X.
Right.
Anyway.
Yeah.
Intuitively, I would think that, yeah, if you're rotating a lot, then you're going to have a line. But okay. Anyway, and just to highlight again, I think this is well established. These again are for all non-rotating progenitors, but there's now been 3 codes, 5 papers, 2 of which include the neutron star full problem. These ones excise the core, do various other numerical things, but we're all in basically qualitative and quantitative agreement. And so with 3 codes, I think this is a result one could trust.
well, wait. It sounds like it's still
Computational, numerical,
very
experimental.
tentatively that in 3D you get comparable kicks to 2D.
Yes, that's true. So this you might want to wait on a little bit longer. There's been no calculation with the neutron star on the core in 3D. And what I'm going to talk about next is very controversial and says something about how 3D might change over 2D calculations. So you might want to wait on this. In 2D, it seems to be no problem. In 3D, maybe it's somewhat less. I don't know. But, okay. So what I would say is controversial at this point is, does 3D inherently change the qualitative outcomes of the explosions in any way? And what I'm going to argue is possibly, yes, at least it did when I did the calculations, and other groups will argue different things, and I'll kind of tell you what other groups might say. So to do 3D calculations, I had to use a new code. This is an adaptive mesh. Again, this is Castro. It stands for compressible astrophysics. It's rad hydro. It's been around now for, I think, well, this is basically 3 or 4 years now it's been around. The great thing about it and why we can use it in core classes is adaptive mesh. It's some cycles in time too. So because most of your star is essentially just inflowing spherical material, all the really interesting stuff happens way down in the center of the star itself. So you can blanket this interior region with tons of resolution, and you can have basically not a lot of resolution everywhere else. And that allows you to really speed up the calculations over what other groups do, but fixed grid codes still and things like that. The radiation is multi-reflexive and diffusion. Gravity can be monopolar or Poisson sols in the multi-grid. And the nice thing about this too is it scales to over 200,000 cores in the weak limit. But it actually scales fairly well in this problem in the strong limit too. So the people, the team basically, I mean, I spent like almost a year getting this thing ready to do science, but the team is Anna Holmgren and John Bell at Morris Berkeley National Lab. Lewis Howell is doing some of the radiation stuff, and Livermore and myself and Adam at Princeton at the time. These are just some eye candy from some initial tests we did. Neutron stars down here on the grid. You get these kind of spherical explosions in some cases. You get these large kind of asymmetries. It already looks to me fundamentally different from what you would see in 2D. You notice here you don't really see any kind of axis effects of any sort. That's nice, I think. Here's what kind of an explosion might look like in 3D. What you're going to do here is you're going to see the shock start to come out here. These layers will keep falling in, and as this passes through them, you'll see kind of the structure more. There you go. So down here is the gain region. This one will propagate outward through this layer here. Kind of get this bubbling going on. But what I really see in the 3D calculations are these large fragmented structures. You sometimes see low entropy sheets coming or low entropy plumes, like vortexes. You kind of get like a lot of interesting detailed structure. A lot of the movies that I made are very biological in nature. I'll show some more examples in a second. But the thing to notice here is you get kind of some asymmetry here, and you get very turbulent regions behind it. And it's just interesting looking at 3D, I think. Here's an example of an explosion. This is a isos entropy surface. Goes right interior to where the shock is. And again, you can see these large structures kind of forming here. Neutron stars down in the center. There's a low entropy plume that propagates down here. This to me kind of looks like a brain, I think. But it's very different than what you would expect in 2D, which is a lot of up and down motion and a lot of an explosion. Here's a movie which kind of shows the surface of the shock. The colors show you how far away you are from the average of the sphere that it would be. And you can see kind of as it's blowing up here, it's not really strongly deformed like you were pointing out. It's kind of lumpy. It's more like a weird looking potato or something propagating outward. There is asymmetry here, obviously, but there's not the strong up and down sloshing that people associate with this L=1 standing accretion shock instability.
So all these are, again, with neutrinos cranked up, so something interesting happens? Or?
Yeah, so we get an explosion. And so the reason we still are doing, or at least we were, I was still doing crew transport here, is because if you do actually the multi-reflux loaded in this kind of case, it's about 6 or 9 months on 100,000 cores to do the first 100 milliseconds of postbound. So if you want to do like maybe a sixth or a tenth of the problem, you have to wait 9 months and use half of one of the largest supercomputers in the country, which is crazy. So until you do the full-blown 3D transport of 3D hydro, I think that's like maybe 5 years off or something.
Did we see the stall phase in this?
Sorry, what's that?
Are we looking at it when it's stalled, or are we looking at it?
No, you're looking at it as it's propagating outward, so it's exploding outward. Yeah, but that's again because you cranked up the neutrino luminosity to induce some sort of explosion.
Does it stall then?
It stalls, yeah, and then it blows up afterwards. So you actually, that's right, that movie started at the point where kind of the explosion commenced. Okay, so one of the first projects, science projects I did with this new code was to just isolate the effect of spatial dimension on the outcomes and see if there's a difference, because this code you can do is spherically symmetric, axisymmetric, and fully 3D Cartesian. I wanted to see if you keep everything else the same, transport algorithm, hydrodynamics, equation of state, progenitors, all that stuff is the same, and just vary the spatial dimension, do you see sort of any difference in the outcomes? And what I found, at least in 1D and 2D, was what others have suggested before, is that in spherically symmetric calculation, at this particular point in time, the axisymmetric counterpart is already starting to explode. And there's one big difference between spherically symmetric cases and axisymmetric cases, which is that you can basically have turbulence in a 2D calculation. So in a 1D calculation, really you can just go radially inward and outward. So the material that's diffusing in can go in or out, and diffuse this like this. Whereas in 2D it goes this way, but then also go this way.
So when you do 1D image for the stellar analogy, do you do something like a stupid mixing length approach to convection, or do you include nothing?
No, include nothing.
Okay, so that's really even it's fake.
Right, it's fake. There's no mixing length. There's no.
Really, if you want to compare, you should at least do something silly like that.
Well, you could do something silly like that. Yeah, that's right. But I mean, we know this is wrong, right? So, okay. So isolating everything else, no mixing like that, nothing like that. 1D and 2D, very different. That's a good point. What I saw and what was not known, I think, at the time is that the axisymmetric calculation at this point in time is not exploding, but its 3D counterpart at the same time is actually exploding. And again, you can go this way, and you can go this way, but then you can also go this way in 3D. So there's an extra degree of freedom, possibly in the flow, that you can tap into. And that may be why this is blowing up, while this was not blowing up. So this was an interesting result because what we saw was that the time of the explosion was a strong function of dimension. Everything else is fixed equally. And what this shows here is what's spherically symmetric, axisymmetric, and Cartesian. And so at this point in time, the 3D explosion calculation is exploding, but its 2D counterpart takes much, much longer to explode. And here for the 1.7, this one blows up at about 400 milliseconds, and its 2D counterpart hadn't after 1.5.
So the 1.7 is the multiplication of the neutrino luminosity.
That's the driving neutrino luminosity, that's right, yeah. And so that was very interesting. And you can plot that on something like what's called a critical curve for explosion, which shows neutrino-driven luminosity versus the m dot at the time of the explosion. And what we saw is that 1D is up here. So if you want to explode at 1D, these are basically the curves that delineate where explosions happen. So if you're above this curve in 1D, you lie up here, then you'll explode in 1D. If you're above down here, you'll explode in 2D, but not in 1D. And if you live down here, you explode in 3D, but not 2D or 1D. And so the thinking at the time was that if nature, the track that a real star takes is somewhere down in here, this could at least explain why we're getting exploded, why we're not getting explosions in 1D and 2D, but possibly could get explosions in 3D. Now, since this was a big effect at the time, it's a factor of 2 difference between 1D and 3D, and that's a huge amount. A factor of 2 in core collapse is huge. I mean, often people are talking about 1% effects, maybe a few percent effects, not factors of 2. Now, since this has come out, there was one bug in the code in the gravity solver. So what happened actually is this curve shifts up to right about here. There's still a sizable gap here that's about 10 to 15%, but it's not 25% difference anymore between these. It's right in here. Okay. So I don't know if nature does this, and I don't know where a real star lives on here in nature, but I thought this was at least an interesting thing. 3D seems to help you a lot. And again, it's the paths of these that these free nucleons are taking as they diffuse to a special gain region. They're dwelling longer in these regions here, and the longer you stay in those regions, the more neutrinos you can capture, and the easier it is for you to explode.
Were you able to do any resolution tests?
Yes, yes. I was able to do some, and I'll talk about the resolution in a second because I think that actually is a big deal, and probably why people are seeing different results right now. Okay.
So could you reverse this and actually, instead of, the neutrino luminosity is at some level not the thing that you can tune, but if you now sort of step back and say, how long does something have to stay
Have to
there?
stay in there for it to
For
explode.
it to
So,
explode,
yeah, you could probably, you might be able to do something like that. That's interesting. Doesn't think about it, but yeah, you could probably do something maybe even simpler. Okay. What this?
I have a question on the whole talk. and
Yes.
I think you almost answered it there, but I didn't quite get it. So, yeah, I mean, other than just like extra dimensions makes magic, or turbulence, which is kind of the same thing. I think you now said something that's about the amount of time something spends in
Yes.
its region, right? So,
And that's what this plot
Oh,
is going to
okay.
show. Is that, you only have the
yeah,
one
so
question?
like, I mean, but you said, where are these nucleons? That where are they going when where are they?
Okay, so as the material is falling into that shock region, it's being dissociated, nuclear dissociation. So you're breaking apart the nuclei, and you've got then free neutrons and protons. And the reaction is in the charge current reaction. So the electron neutrinos and the anti-electron neutrinos are capturing on those things. And so the fluid in that region where you have these free nucleons is then reaching higher temperatures and higher entropies. So the longer it stays in there, the more, because it's working its way down here, diffusing and vecting down to the proto-neutron star. So the longer that stuff stays there, the more of those neutrinos it can probably catch gets to higher temperatures and entropies. Maybe it makes it easier to explode.
So it's not about how much time the neutrinos are spending anywhere.
No. The neutrinos are diffusing out. They're
go
it's
and
free
go
streaming. They go out. It's how much maybe the matter is in that gain region. Yes.
So maybe you can clarify something for me.
Okay.
When, I mean, you had the reference to Dolans there, the most recent paper.
Yep.
When I look at the curves in that and compare it to the one you have on the previous slide,
This one.
the 2D and 3D are basically beside each other.
No, they're not. If you look at that,
They're 100
curve-
milliseconds apart.
Yeah, but so m dot goes as 1 over time. It's exactly goes as 1 over time.
But the slope is very small.
No. Okay, so if you look at those ones in that paper, you're right. There's some that are about 100. There's some that are 100 milliseconds. There's some that are a few hundred milliseconds. It's not as big as something like this, but it's not as it's not zero either. It's not like what, for instance, the Garshin group sees in their early simulations. So there is still a sizable difference there. That's about the order of 10%.
Okay, do you have an updated plot of the next plot?
The next one, no, I don't have an updated plot of the next one, but we can talk about it later. I'll show you my Okay. So you can show this kind of dwell time distribution between the particles in the axisymmetric calculations and the particles in the fully 3D calculations. And what you basically see is that the colors here are for the axisymmetric, and the contours roughly match where the colors are for the 3D. So in 3D, you see on average, this is showing average entropy in the gain region, or entropy in the gain region for those particular particles. What you're seeing on averages, the entropy is much higher. It's almost a unit higher in 3D than it is in the 2D calculations, and there's a much longer tail. So you get the whole tail of the particles are getting to much higher entropies. Now, whether this actually is the reason why they exploded earlier in 3D, I'm not entirely sure. Some people would say no, some would say maybe, some might say yes. I think this is still up in the air as to what's actually causing the explosions in 3D versus in 2D. Again, you can see you get higher entropies and longer dwell times in 3D than you get in 2D and 1D. Now, to talk about what other groups have seen, so there's been two other groups that have done this independently. One is Thomas Janka's group in Garching, and that's this plot here, and the other is Sean Couch at the University of Chicago. And what they're seeing is quantitatively, I think, and qualitatively different than what I'm seeing, and qualitatively and quantitatively different from each other also. And so we've all basically tried to do the same thing with little differences in the algorithms. So this is a little bit disturbing. So what the Garching group saw is that if you explode early, basically, there's almost no difference in between 2D and 3D. But if you explode late, this orange line here, then you get 3D exploding much earlier than the 2D counterpart here, at a fixed resolution. Okay. they plot this in this kind of, again, this critical curve for the 15 solar mass progenitor, which is the one that I used, and also for this 11 solar mass progenitor. In the 11 solar mass progenitor, they see a difference here of about 10% in the 11 solar mass progenitor. In the 15 solar mass progenitor, they see something that looks a little bit odd to me. They see sometimes they get the points to overlap, the 2D and 3D to happen at the same time, and sometimes they don't. So like, for instance, why this guy is way out here, even though it's a higher luminosity, it should have exploded earlier, so it should, this one in comparison to this one should be like over here somewhere. I don't exactly know what's going on there. But if you connect these lines, they say this one exploded at the same time, but they've got also 4 outliers out here. If you connect these lines here, again, it's something like a 10-15% difference here. Now, as they increase the resolution, what they found is that the 2D actually exploded earlier in time. So they're not converging the 2D, and they're finding that the 2D is exploding earlier and earlier and earlier. They didn't include any info for a 3D resolution study, so it's hard to say. They have also very low resolution compared to what I have, so it's not quite clear how they compare these. Sean Couch is finding something even different from the Garcian group and different from me, which is that 2D is always exploding earlier than 3D. So here's his 2D, and here's the 3D. Here's the 2D, and here's the 3D. And this is a huge difference now also in the explosion times. So that's also very interesting.
What's his resolution?
His resolution is closer to mine, but it's still less than mine is. So his resolution is 0.7 kilometers when he does the comparison, whereas I have a ½ kilometer. So he does ½ kilometer for the 1D and the 2D, but does not do it for the 3D. So, so his critical curves look like this. In 1D, he's converged, and in 2D, he's clearly not converged. Actually, what he's seeing in 2D as he's up the resolution is that the explosions occur much later in time for 2D. And again, there's no information on what 3D does. So also very hard to compare. So I think at this point, it's up in the air as to whether the 3D makes any sort of difference. I mean, I think it probably does. I'm almost, well, my general feeling is that it probably does. But I think we're probably years away from knowing whether that's true or not. And just to summarize, there's no quantitative agreement, I think. So this work I did in 2010, even though we're 3 years later, still has the highest resolution of anything that's been done so far. And I see that 3D explodes earlier in time. And again, the Dolan's results show the same thing. 3D explodes earlier in time, although there's a 0.5% error in the gravity solver, so it explodes a little bit. I mean, it explodes earlier, not as dramatic an effect for me, but still something like a 10-15% effect. The Garcian group has the lowest resolution. They get some of their 3D models exploding earlier, some at the same time. And then Sean Couch's simulations have what I call moderate resolution, close to mine, but not as high. And he's seeing that 3D explodes later. So we have 3 different kind of outcomes, I would say, with 3 different codes that use very similar numerical methods. So I don't exactly know what's going on. And again, I think this is a strong function of the resolution. I am probably sure, at least the 2D results show that these 2 are not converged. I did 2D results when I did these, and I saw basically the 2D exploding later within maybe like 20 millisecond differences. So it wasn't a big deal for me at the time I did it, although maybe it makes a difference in 3D. I can't go any higher in 3D than I currently am at. Although again, maybe down the road in a few years, someone can go higher. I don't know. So I think this is kind of a controversial result that's up in the air. Okay. Questions on any of that before I spend like 10 minutes talking, a few minutes talking about work I've been doing with deaf and hard hearing students?
I mean, this is all dependent, it seems, then on essentially diffusion and random walking of various things.
Probably evection, yeah.
And which is certainly can look like a diffusion if it's random enough. But I mean, all these codes are dissipative numerical properties of these things are all really especially with the AMR and that kind of thing. So
yeah, and
kind of hinting that might be part of it.
Yeah, I mean it's certainly part of it. I mean there's large, when you use AMR you get large perturbations initially over what you would do from fixed grid calculations, for instance. The amount of numerical dissipation in simulations could also somehow affect it. It's not clear, I think, at this point. So I think it's an interesting, intriguing idea because there might be a physical difference you'd expect between 2D and 3D, but whether that actually turns out to be important or not, I think it's going to take maybe half a decade or more. You really want to do it with the actual full-blown neutrino transport too. These are all with a very crude algorithm for the transport. It's just kind of dialed using neutrino meltings up and down. So the takeaway is that there might be something interesting there, but I would probably wait to see what happens. Okay, so so basically I've been working with, so at RIT we have the National Technical Institute for the Deaf, which I'll talk more about in a second, but we basically have 1,600 deaf students on the RIT campus, which is about 10% of the population. So in the United States, about 1 million people are functionally deaf, and what that means is they can't hear anything. 3 to 9 million people have some sort of severe hearing impairment, and 12 to 43 million people have some kind of hearing loss. These typically tend to happen later in life, although a lot of these might be 50% later in life, 50% when you're very young or born. In Canada, it's about, so I looked these numbers up before I came, it's about 350,000 people are functionally deaf.
That must be a definition
Yeah,
difference,
how
right?
can that
Should be a factor of 30.
Should be a factor of 30?
10, sorry.
10, it's a factor of 10, yeah. Well, I mean, okay. So,
Anyway,
yeah.
it's a lot. That's I guess your point.
I mean, so that's a good point. It's very difficult to know because, so where do you get this information? In the US, you get it from the Census Bureau. On the census itself, actually, there's not a box you can check that's like deaf or use ASL or hard of hearing. You can't check those boxes. You can check a box about disabilities. So they do these follow-up surveys here, which sample a subset of the population and try to get more at those. But again, it's very hard to get the numbers, which is why you see 3 to 9 million a year, 1 million a year. In the Canadian census, I think it's the same thing. They have this PAL survey. So there's big error bars probably on these numbers. Actually, it's interesting, in the US, in the 1880 census, they did have a box that you could check if you were deaf. So there's actually very good statistics about deaf people right before the turn of the century, and then after that, they stopped having that on the census, so hard to tell. But the takeaway here is that it's not a small amount of population. It's actually a decent size fraction of population, maybe 0.5%, 1/3%, 2%, if you consider fully functionally deaf. Okay. So in North America, we use American Sign Language. It's one of many manual languages around the world. It's originated basically at the American School for the Deaf, which was originally called American Asylum in Hartford, Connecticut. Borrows elements of French Sign Language and British Sign Language, and that's because Francois Gallaudet brought over Laurent Clerc, who is from France, and they basically established the school there. So there's strong elements of French Sign Language and British Sign Language in American Sign Language. It was established as a formal language. It's an NSF-funded project in 1960 by William Stokey. And that actually was a big moment in deaf history because it not only established it as a formal language with unique syntax and grammar. Because before that time, it was thought to just be, I don't know, not any sort of thing, just something people did, I guess. And so I'm going to show kind of just a short video on deaf culture and perspective. And what you're going to see is you're going to see in this, you're going to see a bunch of young people saying what they want to do when they grow up in ASL. You're going to see a term called autism in here, which is the belief that basically having hearing leads to some sort of higher quality of life. And the deaf community basically rejects that. So I'll just show this quickly. So there's a saying in the deaf community that deaf people can do anything except hear. With a very strong community, and actually all of these children were basically picked professions or sent something on a profession, which I can give you multiple examples of deaf people in each of those professions. Now, you didn't see anyone in there say they wanted to be an astronomer, so just note that. So if you're deaf or hard of hearing and you want to go into secondary or you want to go into college studies in the U.S., there are basically 2 higher education institutes you can go to. One is Rochester Institute of Technology, the National Technical Institute of the Deaf, and the other is Gallaudet University in Washington, D.C. And now these differ a little bit from each other in that Gallaudet is signing only, so there's no speaking, it's everyone signs on campus. RIT and NTID take a different approach that we basically we accommodate. So we'll have some students that are hearing impaired but can speak somewhat, and they prefer to kind of speak or do lip reading or something like that, even or do that. Whereas we have other students who just sign only. So as people who teach at NTID, we're required to basically communicate in whichever way the student prefers. And I'll talk more about that in a second. So NTID was established in 1965 by LBJ. Here's a picture of him signing it into law on the RIT campus. We have 1,600 students, 10% of the RIT student body, and it's the largest technical institute for deaf students in the world. So we draw students from all over the U.S. and all over the world, very, very bright students who want to go to college and learn. And it's fantastic. And here's just a picture of some of the countries that we have students from. Okay. There are several examples of very famous deaf astronomers. John Goodricky here, he's the youngest Copley Medal winner. He was fully deaf when he was born. Then you have Henrietta Leavitt. So she worked at the Harvard College Observatory, carrying women simulations for Cepheid at the same time that Annie Jump Cannon did. And again, so there's the Annie Jump Cannon Award, and she's a Draper Medal winner. These 2 women lost their hearing around their teenage years. So here right away are 3 examples of famous deaf astronomers from basically before the turn of the century and before. Now, since that time, there are no deaf or hard of hearing astronomers that I know of. And I think there's a reason for that, because I think currently there are a few opportunities for deaf students to pursue higher education careers in astronomy. And I put the few in here, but I actually think this might be no opportunities. And I'll talk a minute about that. So again, at the higher educational institutes in the U.S., there's Gallaudet, which does not have any courses or majors in physics or astronomy at all. And there's NTID, which has courses in physics but no courses in astronomy. So if you want to go and take a college course in astronomy and you're deaf, you can't go anywhere to do it. There are no current courses in astronomy in ASL in the country. Okay, so what I've been doing for the last basically year and a half is I've been doing a couple things at NTID. One is that I've developed an astronomy class that I will teach in ASL in the fall for NTID. Again, it's the only collegiate level course offered in ASL in the US. And so you said fall 2013. The other thing I've been doing, I've been supporting NTID students that are in RIT upper level physics and astronomy classes. So you can go and you can take a physics class. What happens then is an interpreter is brought in. An interpreter probably does not know anything about the subject. You know, if you're in quantum mechanics, you bring in an interpreter. You can imagine the problems with this. The interpreter standing here, hearing all these words that they don't know the meaning of, and they're just, in some cases, they're making up signs for those specific technical terms. And so it becomes very, very difficult for the students to follow. They're trying to take notes, trying to look over here, but they have to look at the interpreter. It actually becomes very, very problematic. Much better to have a signing instructor who understands the material than it is to have an interpreter. And then the last thing is we have this project, NSF-funded project Astrodance, which is now is touring in 6 different states. I think we've had 12 productions of it so far, which is it's a dance project which uses ASL to kind of tell the story of the hunt for gravitational waves in LIGO. Okay, so if you're teaching, there's like 3 things you must do when you're kind of introducing like science signs. So the first thing you need to do to have a student understand is you need to fingerspell the word. The second thing you need to do is you need to set up the sign and you need to show that sign. And the third thing you need to do is you need to explain the meaning. And if you do those 3 things, then basically the students will understand. And if you don't, there's like mass confusion. They just will not understand what you're talking about. So you have to do those things. And I'll show kind of an example of just some science signs that have been developed. This was actually in an article in the New York Times about 2 months ago. Leah Callis, she she was Mayor Bloomberg's interpreter during Superstorm Sandy, and she's an NTIE graduate of 2010. So I'll just show one of these quickly. So she's signing light year, and then what she's going to do is she's going to finger spell it on one side and just show the sign on the right side. So you can imagine you don't want to finger spell anything because that's not teaching meaning. It's not, plus it takes a long time. What you want to do is you want to design a sign that shows some sort of meaning to it. So she's signing light with something that shows distance in it. Maybe it's not the best sign, and you want to do something with time and year and incorporate that into the sign. But you can kind of explain that when you do meaning. And then another example is mass, the sign for mass versus finger spelling mass. Mass is a short word, so you might be able to get away with finger spelling it, but again, it's better to have sign signs. And then weight, she's signing weight versus finger spelling weight. So, at RIT, we have a science lexicon, which you can go and you can search by field. So you can look for physics, you can look for chemistry, you can look for biology. We have astronomy too, although some of these signs are not probably in use today or not good representations. So, but it is a place to start and to kind of and to see what's out there for the signs and maybe signs that need to have more better versions of the signs developed. One thing that's different when you're teaching in a deaf class is that the traditional structure for it. If I'm walking down the hallway and I run into a deaf colleague, what happens is they basically, it doesn't matter what the subject is, if it's what they did on the weekend, if it's a very technical thing, if it's something else, they always have this kind of like lecture structure. So the shape kind of looks like a triangle. And what happens is there's an opening, and then you explain the meaning all through the conversation, and you close it again. And the opening and the closing are basically the same. And the point is that you tell the person immediately when you start talking to them, what's the point of this topic? So in English, you might just start talking, say some introductory material. It's not quite clear. The point of the subject comes later. This is more like a scientific paper where there's an abstract they can read, then you explain all the details, and then you can read the conclusions. And so if you set up your lectures in these diamond shapes, you can really help the students kind of understand that. And again, this is like conversational stuff with friends who will have these kinds of structures. They've really grown up their entire life with structures like that. So if you think about that when you make a lecture, it really will help the students. Okay, Astrodance, this is the last thing. Astrodance, again, is an NSF-funded project. We combine theater students at NTID with scientists at RIT, and it's been interesting because I'm the only scientist there that's science, so I've kind of been a liaison between both, the deaf faculty and students, and then the actual scientists in the Center for Computational Relativity and Gravitation. Here's some pictures of just the production. So we also incorporate our work, so our simulations. This is a binary black hole simulation. And we have a narrator who signs. There's also voiced over too. And we introduce the words, we explain the meaning, and then they show the dance following it. There you go. There's you're stretching some rubber bands in this particular dance. And I always say this, thank you to the NSF, because the NSF, I think, is the only funding agency that would fund something like this. They funded Stokey's first paper in the 1960s. They fund a lot of the outreach. You can't ever see NASA funding this. NSF has actually really provided a lot of funding for all of these projects. And so I always thank the NSF for their support. So I'll just I'll stop there and just say that hopefully the takeaway here is there's three things to take away. One is that pulsars can be accelerated naturally in core collapse events in 2D, possibly, maybe in 3D. That, oh my gosh, this is okay. The dimensional dependence might be important. It's not clear yet at this stage, and I don't think we'll know for many years. And that I'm doing some very interesting, I think, work at NTID trying to develop science opportunities for deaf and hard of hearing students. So, thank you.
Any questions? Okay, so we will take Jason tonight for dinner. So we will be gathering at